On August 12th, 30 BCE, the most powerful woman in the ancient world drew her final breath. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, closed her eyes forever in a palace chamber overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. But here's the thing that has haunted archaeologists for over 2,000 years. No one knows where she was buried. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about one of history's most famous rulers, a woman who commanded fleets, negotiated with Rome's greatest generals, and controlled the wealth of Egypt. Yet her final resting place remains one of archaeology's greatest unsolved mysteries. And the search for her tomb has become an obsession that's consumed decades of research, millions of dollars, and the careers of brilliant minds who refuse to give up. But what if I told you that right now, in 2025, we might be closer than ever to solving this ancient puzzle? What if the answer has been hiding beneath our feet all along, waiting in a flooded tunnel that stretches deep underground, carved into bedrock over 2 millennia ago? Tonight, we're diving into a mystery that involves snake-filled baskets, underwater temples, a Dominican lawyer who abandoned everything to chase an impossible dream, and recent discoveries that have sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Because the search for Cleopatra's tomb isn't just about finding a burial site, it's about rewriting history itself. The story begins with what should have been a simple historical fact. When Cleopatra died, ancient writers like Plutarch recorded that she was buried alongside Mark Antony, her lover and political ally, in a tomb that was described as splendid and regal. The Roman leader Octavian, despite his fury at being robbed of parading Cleopatra through Rome as a prisoner, honored her final request. According to every historical account, the burial happened. The tomb existed. But then, something extraordinary occurred. It vanished. Not gradually, not piece by piece over centuries. The entire mausoleum, along with the most famous woman in the ancient world, simply disappeared from the historical record. And for over 1,000 years, no one has been able to explain how something so significant could be so completely lost. Most archaeologists have always assumed the obvious answer. Cleopatra was buried in Alexandria, her capital city, somewhere beneath the modern metropolis. It made perfect sense. That's where she lived, where she ruled, where she died. But here's where the story takes its first strange turn. More than a millennium ago, a massive tidal wave struck Alexandria. Entire sections of the ancient city were swallowed by the Mediterranean Sea. Palaces, temples, and yes, likely tombs, all pulled beneath the waves. For generations, this seemed to explain the mystery. Cleopatra's tomb was probably down there somewhere, lost in the underwater ruins of her sunken capital. End of story. Case closed. Except for one problem. Not everyone was willing to accept that answer. In 2002, a woman named Kathleen Martinez made a decision that would change her life forever. Martinez wasn't an archaeologist. She was a successful Dominican lawyer, born into a family of academics, with a thriving legal practice and no formal training in ancient history. But she had something else, an obsession that had been growing since 1990, when an argument with her father about Cleopatra's significance sparked a deep dive into the Queen's real story. What Martinez discovered was that almost everything the modern world thinks it knows about Cleopatra comes from Roman propaganda, the seductress who destroyed 2 great Roman men, the decadent queen who bathed in milk and lounged on golden barges. Most of it was character assassination, written by the victors to justify their conquest of Egypt. The real Cleopatra spoke 9 languages, was a brilliant strategist, and ruled one of the richest empires in the ancient world for nearly 2 decades. But Martinez noticed something else in the historical records, something that made her question the entire accepted narrative about where Cleopatra was buried. You see, Cleopatra didn't just think of herself as a political ruler. She believed she was the living embodiment of the goddess Isis, the most important deity in the Egyptian pantheon. Isis was the goddess of motherhood, magic, and healing, But most importantly for our story, she was the wife of Osiris, the god of the afterlife. According to Egyptian mythology, when Osiris was killed and dismembered by his jealous brother Seth, Isis gathered the pieces and brought him back to life. It's one of the most powerful resurrection stories in human history, and it formed the foundation of Egyptian beliefs about death and the afterlife. If you were an Egyptian pharaoh, being identified with Osiris meant you would live forever, and if you were Cleopatra, identifying yourself with Isis meant something even more profound. Martinez began to develop a theory that would make her the laughingstock of the archaeological establishment. What if Cleopatra wasn't buried in Alexandria at all? What if her death was planned as a religious ritual, designed to reenact the Isis and Osiris myth? What if she deliberately chose to be buried, not in her capital, but in a sacred temple dedicated to the very gods she claimed to embody? It was a radical idea. It went against decades of accepted wisdom, and it led Martinez to a place that most archaeologists had written off as archaeologically insignificant, a ruined temple complex called Taposiris Magna, located about 25 miles west of Alexandria. The name itself was tantalizing. Taposiris Magna means the Great Tomb of Osiris, but when Martinez first visited the site in 2002, it didn't look like much. Just broken walls, scattered stones, and a partially restored tower that had been used in the 1,930 seconds to help reconstruct Alexandria's famous lighthouse. Most experts who had studied the site assumed it was just another provincial temple, interesting to historians, but hardly the final resting place of Egypt's most famous queen. Martinez saw something different. Call it intuition, call it obsession, but when she walked through those ruins, she knew she was in the right place. The problem was convincing anyone else. She was a lawyer, not an archaeologist. She had no formal training, no institutional backing, no credibility in the field. What she had was a theory, unlimited determination, and the willingness to risk everything on what most people considered an impossible dream. In 2004, Martinez managed to convince Zahi Hawass, Egypt's most powerful archaeologist, to give her a chance. It wasn't easy. Hawass was skeptical, to put it mildly. But something about Martinez's passion, her legal mind's approach to analyzing evidence, and perhaps her outsider's perspective, made him willing to let her try. She was granted permission to excavate at Taposiris Magna, and that's when Martinez made a decision that separated her from every other amateur treasure hunter or archaeological enthusiast in history. She didn't just visit Egypt for a few weeks. She didn't hire local workers and supervise from afar. In 2005, Kathleen Martinez closed her law practice, left her comfortable life in the Dominican Republic, and moved to Egypt permanently. She would spend the next 20 years of her life digging in the sand, searching for evidence that everyone else believed didn't exist. The early years were brutal. Archaeological excavation is back-breaking work, especially in the Egyptian desert. Days that start before dawn and end after sunset, carefully removing sand, grain by grain, cataloguing every pottery shard and broken tile. And for years Martinez found exactly what her critics expected. Nothing that proved Cleopatra was buried at Taposiris Magna. But she did find other things. Things that began to suggest this wasn't just another provincial temple. She discovered 27 tombs, some shaped like traditional sarcophagi, others featuring elaborate staircases leading to underground burial chambers. She found 10 mummies, 2 of them gilded, indicating they belonged to people of high status. Most intriguingly, she began uncovering coins, lots of coins, and many of them bore a very familiar face. The face on those coins belonged to Cleopatra VII herself, not the Hollywood version with Elizabeth Taylor's features, but the real Cleopatra, with her distinctive hooked nose and strong jawline. These weren't just random ancient coins that happened to end up at the site. They were deliberately placed there, buried within the temple walls themselves, as if someone wanted to mark this place as connected to Egypt's last pharaoh. But Martinez needed more than coins to prove her theory. She needed to find evidence that this temple was specifically dedicated to Isis, the goddess Cleopatra claimed to embody. And that meant finding something archaeologists had been searching for since Napoleon's expedition in the 1800s, the foundation plate. In ancient Egyptian construction, foundation plates were small stone tablets placed beneath major structural stones. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of a cornerstone, containing crucial information about when a temple was built, why it was constructed, and most importantly, which deity it honored. For over 200 years, excavation teams had combed through Taposiris Magna, looking for this iPhone-sized piece of carved stone. Every single one had failed. Martinez was determined to be different. Instead of focusing on the most obvious locations, she decided to excavate the entire temple complex systematically. It was an enormous undertaking, requiring permits, funding, and years of meticulous work. Most archaeologists thought she was wasting her time on an impossible task. Then, in what can only be described as archaeological lightning striking, Martinez found it. After just 3 months of systematic excavation, her team uncovered the foundation plate that had eluded researchers for 2 centuries. When they translated the ancient Greek text, Martinez's heart must have been pounding. The inscription read, "The king of High and Low Egypt, Ptolemy V, lives forever beloved by Isis, son of Ptolemy IV, king of High and Low Egypt, and his wife, Arsinoe III, both benevolent gods, consecrated this temple to the mother Isis." There it was, undeniable proof that Taposiris Magna had been built as a temple to Isis, exactly as Martinez had theorized. But even as excitement rippled through the archaeological community, skeptics pointed out a crucial problem. Ancient Egyptian maps made no reference to an Isis temple at this location. If this was such an important religious site, why wasn't it recorded anywhere? The answer came when Martinez's team made their next discovery. Adjacent to the original temple, they found the remains of a second structure. This wasn't unusual in Egyptian religious architecture. Major deities often had paired temples, one for the male god and another for the female goddess. What was unusual was what they found when they traced the layout of this second temple. It led directly into the Mediterranean Sea. Martinez's mind raced as she put the pieces together. If major earthquakes had struck the region between 320 and 1303 CE, as geological evidence suggested, then entire sections of the temple complex could have collapsed into the sea. The missing references in ancient maps suddenly made sense. The temples had been there, but part of the complex was now underwater, lost to the same tidal forces that had claimed sections of Alexandria. This realization led Martinez to reach out to Robert Ballard, the underwater explorer famous for discovering the Titanic. If she was right, if there were submerged structures connected to Taposiris Magna, she would need expertise in underwater archaeology to prove it. The Egyptian government, intrigued by the implications of her discoveries, provided resources and even offered support from their Marine Corps. What Ballard's team found beneath the waves defied expectations. 3-meter-tall structures that clearly weren't natural rock formations. Carved basalt, the same material used in statues found in the land-based temple, human remains, pottery, and most remarkably, man-made chambers and corridors extending far from shore, some as distant as 10 kilometers from the coast. The underwater discoveries painted a picture of a vast religious complex that had once stretched from the desert temple all the way to elaborate structures beneath the sea. But Martinez knew that even these remarkable finds wouldn't satisfy the skeptics. She needed something more. Something that would prove beyond doubt that this wasn't just an important religious site, but the actual burial place of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. That's when her team made the discovery that changed everything. In 2022, using ground-penetrating radar and careful excavation techniques, they uncovered something that took their breath away. Deep beneath the main temple, Carved into solid bedrock was a tunnel. Not just any tunnel, but what the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities would later describe as a geometric miracle. The tunnel stretched for over 4,300 feet, with walls that rose 6.5 feet high, extending roughly 43 feet underground. The precision of its construction was extraordinary, evoking comparisons to the architectural marvels of ancient Greece and Egypt. But what made this discovery truly exceptional was where the tunnel led. It disappeared into darkness, heading towards sealed chambers that no human had entered for over 2 millennia. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies beyond those chambers, suggesting additional rooms, possibly burial chambers, waiting in the depths. And most tantalizingly, parts of the tunnel were flooded, likely due to the same seismic activity that had sent portions of the temple complex sliding into the Mediterranean. Martinez stood at the entrance to that tunnel, knowing that somewhere in the darkness ahead might lie the answer to a mystery that had consumed her adult life. The tunnel was too dangerous to explore without proper equipment and safety measures. Water levels fluctuated with the tides. Ancient support beams might have weakened over the centuries. But every instinct told her that this was it. This was the path that would lead to Cleopatra's tomb. The implications were staggering. If Martinez was right, if Cleopatra and Mark Antony were buried somewhere in this underground labyrinth, it would represent one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. It would rewrite our understanding of Ptolemaic burial practices, confirm theories about Cleopatra's religious beliefs, and provide an unfiltered look at two of history's most controversial figures. But the tunnel also raised new questions. Why build such an elaborate underground passage? Was it meant to connect different parts of the temple complex? Was it a ceremonial route for religious processions? Or was it something else entirely? A secret pathway designed to hide the most precious burial in Egyptian history from Roman eyes and grave robbers. As Martinez prepared for the next phase of excavation, she couldn't have known that her most dramatic discoveries were still to come. In December 2024, Martinez's team made a discovery that sent ripples through archaeological circles worldwide. As they carefully excavated beneath the southern wall of the temple complex, their brushes revealed something that made Martinez's pulse quicken. A white marble bust emerged from the sand, depicting a young woman wearing what appeared to be a royal crown. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the features delicate yet strong, carved with the kind of precision reserved for the most important figures in ancient society. But this wasn't just any ancient sculpture. As more sand fell away, the team uncovered additional treasures that seemed almost too perfect to be real. A half-length statue of a king wearing the traditional Nemes headdress, the striped cloth crown that had adorned pharaohs for millennia, bronze statues that gleamed despite their age. A limestone container that had once held cosmetics, still bearing traces of ancient preparations. And perhaps most significantly, 337 bronze and silver coins, many bearing the unmistakable profile of Cleopatra VII herself. Martinez stood in the excavation pit, holding one of those coins up to the desert Sunday. The image staring back at her was the same face she'd been studying for over 2 decades. The hooked nose, the strong chin, the regal bearing that Roman propaganda had tried so hard to diminish. But was the marble bust truly Cleopatra? The features were similar, yet different enough to spark immediate debate. The archaeological community erupted in controversy. Martinez believed she was looking at the face of Egypt's last pharaoh, finally revealed after millennia in darkness. But Zahi Hawass, the man who had first given her permission to dig, wasn't convinced. The facial features, he argued, were too different from known depictions of Cleopatra. More troubling, the artistic style appeared Roman rather than Egyptian, and during Cleopatra's era, pharaohs were typically depicted in traditional Egyptian fashion. The debate highlighted a fundamental challenge in Cleopatra archaeology. How do you identify someone when most surviving images were created by enemies who had every reason to distort her appearance? The Romans wanted to portray her as a foreign seductress, a threat to Roman virtue. Egyptian artists, on the other hand, would have depicted her according to traditional pharaonic conventions that emphasized divine authority over individual likeness. But Martinez had something more compelling than artistic arguments. She had context. The bust wasn't found in isolation. It was discovered alongside clear evidence of royal connection to the site. Those 337 coins weren't random ancient currency. They were deliberately placed deposits, buried with ceremonial intention. Many bore not just Cleopatra's image, but inscriptions identifying her by name. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had marked this place as belonging to Egypt's last queen. Among the other artifacts, the team found an amulet inscribed with hieroglyphs reading, "The justice of Ra has risen." In Egyptian mythology, Ra was the sun god, the supreme deity whose justice governed the universe. For this inscription to appear in a burial context suggested someone of extraordinary importance, someone whose death was seen as cosmically significant. The discoveries painted a picture of religious ceremony and royal significance that went far beyond a simple provincial temple. But Martinez knew that even these remarkable finds would only fuel more questions. Skeptics would argue that the artifacts proved royal connection to the site, without necessarily proving Cleopatra was buried there. Important figures throughout Egyptian history had visited temples, made offerings, and left behind traces of their presence. What Martinez needed was access to those sealed chambers beyond the flooded tunnel. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed tantalizing anomalies, but radar couldn't identify human remains or grave goods. Only direct exploration could provide the definitive evidence she sought. The problem was that the tunnel had become increasingly dangerous as excavation progressed. The flooding wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially lethal. Water levels rose and fell, unpredictably, controlled by tidal forces and underground currents that had been building pressure for centuries. Ancient support structures showed signs of stress, and the risk of collapse grew with every passing season. Martinez found herself facing an agonizing choice: risk everything on a dangerous underground expedition, or continue the careful, methodical approach that might take decades to yield results. The pressure wasn't just coming from the site itself. Media attention had exploded following the 2024 discoveries. News outlets around the world were calling it the find of the century, the discovery that would finally solve archaeology's greatest mystery. Documentary crews arrived daily, seeking exclusive access to the excavation. Tourism officials saw dollar signs in the global fascination with Cleopatra's tomb. But Martinez had learned to be suspicious of premature celebration. She'd been digging for 20 years, making steady progress, while enduring constant criticism from establishment archaeologists who questioned her methods, her theories, and her right to lead such an important excavation. The 2024 discoveries had vindicated many of her ideas, but they had also raised the stakes to an almost unbearable level. The international attention brought new resources, but also new complications. Competing theories emerged from other archaeologists, eager to claim credit for solving the mystery. Some argued that the Taposiris Magna finds, while significant, were circumstantial evidence that didn't prove burial location. Others proposed alternative sites, including underwater locations near Alexandria, where Frank Godio's team had been mapping submerged Ptolemaic structures for over 2 decades. Godio's work presented a compelling counter-narrative to Martinez's theory. His surveys of Alexandria's bay had revealed the submerged island of Antirhodos, complete with palace remains and artifacts from Cleopatra's reign. An underwater Isis temple had been identified, along with architectural elements that suggested royal significance. If Cleopatra had been buried in Alexandria, as most scholars believed, Godio argued, her tomb was probably on Antirhodos, positioned symbolically between her palace and the temple of her patron goddess. The debate between land and sea burial sites reflected deeper questions about Cleopatra's final intentions. Had she planned her death as Martinez suggested, choosing burial in a sacred temple that would connect her eternally with the Isis-Osiris myth? Or had she been interred in Alexandria, according to Ptolemaic tradition, with her tomb later lost to natural disasters that plagued the ancient city? Martinez remained convinced that the answer lay in that flooded tunnel beneath Taposiris Magna. Every piece of evidence pointed toward the sealed chambers beyond the water, the foundation plate proving Isis dedication, the coins marking royal connection, the tunnel itself carved with precision that suggested it led somewhere monumentally important. And now, the 2024 discoveries that had revealed ceremonial deposits consistent with royal burial preparation. But as 2025 began, Martinez faced her greatest challenge yet. The Egyptian government, thrilled by international attention but concerned about site safety, had imposed new restrictions on tunnel exploration. Advanced diving equipment would be required. Safety protocols demanded professional underwater archaeologists. Environmental impact studies needed completion before any major excavation of the flooded areas could proceed. The bureaucratic requirements threatened to delay exploration for years, possibly decades. Martinez watched other archaeological teams receive permits for less significant sites while her application for underwater excavation remained buried in governmental review. The irony wasn't lost on her. After 20 years of patient excavation, she might be stopped not by ancient mysteries but by modern paperwork. Yet Martinez had learned something about persistence during her 2 decades in the Egyptian desert. Every major discovery at Taposiris Magna had come when conventional wisdom suggested she should give up. The foundation plate found after 2 centuries of failure. The tunnel discovered when most archaeologists had written off the site. The 2024 artifacts, unearthed when funding was running low and criticism was reaching its peak. Standing at the entrance to that mysterious tunnel, watching water levels rise and fall with the tides, Martinez knew she was closer than ever to answering the question that had consumed her adult life. Somewhere in the darkness beyond, past flooded passages and sealed chambers that had remained untouched since the age of Augustus, the truth about Cleopatra's final resting place was waiting. The next phase of excavation would require everything Martinez had learned about archaeology, diplomacy, and the delicate balance between scientific rigor and intuitive leaps that had brought her this far. Because if she was right, if Cleopatra and Mark Antony were buried somewhere in that underground labyrinth, the discovery would do more than solve an ancient mystery. It would force the world to confront the real Cleopatra, stripped of Roman propaganda and Hollywood mythology, revealed in the context she had chosen for eternity. And for Martinez, it would represent the culmination of an impossible dream that had transformed a successful lawyer into one of archaeology's most controversial and persistent voices. The countdown to that moment had begun, measured not in days or weeks, but in the careful removal of sand grain by grain, the patient analysis of every artifact, and the unwavering belief that some mysteries are worth a lifetime of searching. As Martinez stood at the threshold of what could be archaeology's greatest discovery, she faced a paradox that would have broken lesser spirits. 20 years of excavation had brought her tantalizingly close to the truth, yet the final answers remained locked behind obstacles that seemed almost designed to test her resolve. The flooded tunnel stretched into darkness like a throat, waiting to swallow secrets. Water levels fluctuated with mysterious rhythms, sometimes receding to reveal ancient stone passages, other times surging upward until the entire lower level disappeared beneath murky currents. Each rise and fall of the water felt like the earth itself breathing, guarding whatever lay beyond those sealed chambers with liquid walls that no amount of determination could simply push through. But Martinez had learned something crucial during her decades in the desert. The most significant discoveries often came disguised as insurmountable problems. When everyone else saw flooding as a dead end, she began to see it as preservation. Ancient burial chambers that had remained waterlogged for centuries would be far better preserved than those exposed to air and grave robbers. If Cleopatra's mummy lay somewhere in that submerged labyrinth, it might emerge in a state of preservation that would astound the world. The Egyptian authorities, however, remained unmoved by archaeological poetry. Safety regulations demanded professional diving equipment, certified underwater archaeologists, and environmental impact assessments that could take years to complete. Each permit required signatures from multiple departments, each signature dependent on approvals from other departments, creating a bureaucratic maze that rivaled the physical labyrinth beneath the temple. Meanwhile, the international media circus surrounding the 2024 discoveries had transformed Taposiris Magna from a quiet archaeological site into something resembling a theme park. Tour buses arrived daily, disgorging crowds of visitors eager to glimpse the place where Cleopatra might be buried. Local vendors sold authentic replicas of the marble bust, while documentary crews competed for exclusive access to film Martinez's every move. The attention brought resources Martinez desperately needed, but it also attracted the kind of scrutiny that made her work infinitely more complicated. Every decision was analyzed by experts who had never spent a day digging in the Egyptian Sunday. Every theory was dissected by commentators who confused speculation with scholarship. The woman who had once worked in blissful anonymity now found herself defending not just her methods, but her right to continue the search at all. Critics emerged from universities worldwide, questioning everything from Martinez's interpretation of the foundation plate to her identification of the marble bust. Some argued that the Taposiris Magna evidence, while intriguing, was merely circumstantial. Others proposed that Cleopatra's tomb lay elsewhere entirely, perhaps in one of the dozen alternative sites that various scholars had identified over the years. The most persistent challenge came from underwater archaeologists working in Alexandria's harbour. Frank Godio's team had spent decades mapping the submerged sections of the ancient city, revealing palace complexes and temple foundations that painted a vivid picture of Ptolemaic grandeur beneath the waves. Their discoveries included an underwater Isis temple on the submerged island of Antirhodos, positioned perfectly between Cleopatra's palace and the sacred precinct where she would have worshipped. Godio's argument was compelling in its simplicity. Why would Cleopatra choose burial outside her capital city when Alexandria contained everything necessary for a royal tomb? The underwater Isis temple provided the religious connection Martinez emphasized, while the proximity to Cleopatra's palace satisfied traditional expectations about pharaonic burial practices. Most convincingly, the submerged location explained why the tomb had never been found, despite centuries of searching on land. The debate between the two camps intensified throughout 2024, with each new discovery at Taposiris Magna matched by revelations from Alexandria's harbour. Godio's team uncovered additional artifacts bearing Cleopatra's image, while Martinez's excavations revealed more evidence of royal ceremonies at the desert temple. Rather than settling the question, the parallel discoveries only highlighted how much remained unknown about Egypt's final pharaoh. But Martinez possessed something her critics lacked: intimate familiarity with the site itself. She had spent 2 decades learning to read Taposiris Magna like a book, understanding how different sections of the complex related to each other, recognizing patterns in artifact distribution that visitors might miss entirely. That knowledge had led her to the tunnel, and that same intuition now whispered that the answers lay somewhere beyond the flooded passages. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Robert Ballard, the underwater explorer who had helped Martinez investigate the submerged sections of Taposiris Magna, suggested a different approach to the tunnel problem. Instead of waiting for permits to drain the flooded areas, why not explore them as they were? Underwater archaeology had advanced dramatically since Martinez first began her search. Remote-operated vehicles could navigate spaces too dangerous for human divers. Sonar imaging could map chamber layouts without disturbing ancient contexts. Most importantly, underwater excavation techniques could preserve delicate artifacts that might disintegrate if exposed to air, after centuries of submersion. The proposal electrified Martinez while terrifying Egyptian officials. Underwater exploration of the tunnel would require cutting-edge technology, international expertise, and safeguards that pushed the boundaries of archaeological practice. But it would also bypass many of the bureaucratic obstacles that had stalled traditional excavation. Underwater archaeology fell under different regulatory frameworks, with precedents established by decades of Mediterranean shipwreck exploration. As Martinez prepared her application for underwater investigation of the tunnel, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 20 years earlier, she had been a successful lawyer with no formal archaeological training, driven by little more than curiosity about a historical figure most people knew only from Hollywood movies. Now she stood at the center of international attention, leading excavations that might rewrite ancient history. The irony wasn't lost on her that Cleopatra herself would have appreciated the situation. The last pharaoh had been a master of reinvention, transforming herself from a teenage refugee into the ruler of the richest empire in the Mediterranean. She had navigated Roman politics, Egyptian religion, and international diplomacy with skills that impressed even her enemies. Perhaps it was fitting that her tomb would be discovered not by traditional archaeologists following conventional wisdom, but by an outsider willing to challenge every assumption about where and how Egypt's final queen had chosen to rest. And so the mystery endures. 23 centuries after Cleopatra's death, her tomb remains hidden, protected by flooding, bureaucracy, and the weight of history itself. Martinez continues her vigil at Taposiris Magna, knowing that somewhere in those dark waters lies the answer that could rewrite everything we thought we knew about Egypt's last pharaoh. The question isn't whether Cleopatra's tomb will be found, but whether we're ready for what it might reveal about the woman behind the legend. The search for Cleopatra's tomb has become something far greater than archaeological investigation. It's become a testament to the power of obsession, the value of challenging conventional wisdom, and the enduring mystery of a woman who continues to captivate us more than 2 millennia after her death. Kathleen Martinez's journey from Dominican lawyer to desert archaeologist reminds us that sometimes the most important discoveries come from those willing to risk everything on impossible dreams. Her 20-year quest has already rewritten our understanding of Ptolemaic burial practices, revealed the religious significance of Taposiris Magna, and demonstrated that Cleopatra's story is far more complex than Roman propaganda would have us believe. Whether that flooded tunnel beneath the temple holds the tomb of Egypt's last pharaoh remains to be seen, but perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Cleopatra was a master of mystery in life, a woman who understood that true power sometimes lies in what remains hidden rather than what is revealed. Maybe her greatest triumph is that even in death, she continues to defy our expectations, leading us on a chase that transforms everyone who dares to follow. The next time you hear Cleopatra's name, remember that somewhere beneath the Egyptian desert, in darkness and water that has protected ancient secrets for over 2,000 years, the truth is waiting. And thanks to one woman's refusal to accept the impossible, we might be closer than ever to finally meeting the real Cleopatra face to face.